we're talking about something so basic, so human, that elevates us all. When we talk about these things, that this was America at its best, without expectations of itself. Maybe one thing that unites us all is this story of what happened to these orphans, how they were saved.
It was the dawn of what would become known as the American century. The United States had recovered from its Civil War and was prospering. Immigrants came from around the world in search of a better life, seeking freedom and a piece of fortune. Many thrived.
The time has been called the Age of Reform. It's also been called the Progressive Era. There was a great deal of concern and agitation, really pretty much about the growth of big business and what to do about it.
America, blessed with untapped resources and a population bristling with ambition, was becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. The country had one thing on its mind: business.
Once you get the rise of these big business and these wealthy people, they immediately get into cahoots with political machines. They become dominant or seem to become dominant in politics. And what's this doing to a democratic republic with the popular will? It's clearly not being served.
New York City was the financial capital, and as now, there was a fortune to be made in real estate. One man, Henry Morgenthau, an immigrant himself, owned large swaths of uptown Manhattan and the Bronx.
Henry was educated at Columbia Law School, went on to be a prosperous commercial real estate developer and entrepreneur. And then halfway through that career, fulfilling this American dream, shifts gears and decides it's public service for him. He wants to be part of a do better to the world ethos.
The nation was looking forward, and Henry aligned himself with the progressive, Woodrow Wilson, the governor of New Jersey.
Woodrow Wilson first met Henry Morgenthau sometime in 1911 or 1912. Almost immediately when he got elected governor of New Jersey, he becomes a hot prospect for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1912. He's meeting prominent Democrats. He's meeting prominent campaign contributors. Morgenthau gives good campaign contributions. He has a sterling reputation.
Recognizing Morgenthau's business acumen, Wilson tapped him to be the financial chairman of his presidential campaign. In 1912, running against a divided Republican Party, Wilson beat Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft to become the 28th president.
Morgenthau expected to get some immediate payback for his support. Months later, he was offered the ambassadorship to Turkey.
The United States just is not all that involved there. It's not like being the ambassador to a major Western European capital at all.
Diplomacy was something really new to Morgenthau. He was not prepared to take on the complexities of international relations, but he was a smart guy and a strong sense of moral justice, a strong sense of right and wrong.
His friends and advisors, including Oscar Strauss, the former ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and Rabbi Stephen Weiss, a fellow progressive and activist in New York's Jewish community, urge him to take the post.
Morgenthau's a little bit, he's a little bit miffed by this. He doesn't want to be thought of as the Jew who has to go to the Middle East and be the ambassador to Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, he accepts the post, and it will become the, of course, transformative moment in his life. And he would find himself embroiled quite quickly in the complexity of politics in Turkey on the eve of World War I.
As he set sail for Constantinople, he had no idea that he would soon bear witness to one of the greatest crimes in history. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions was a Protestant missionary organization created in the early 1800s. Its workers spread across the world to win converts with the goal of spiritual salvation.
Islam is pretty well impervious to outside influences. There are very few converts that these missionaries make, but they do establish themselves very much with the indigenous Christians there, especially the Armenians.
I mean, they're really at the core were these old American missionaries. They created hospitals, they created schools, they created technical training units, and they really were part of the warp and weft of non-Muslim society in the Ottoman Empire before the First World War.
During the Atlantic crossing, Morgenthau traveled with James L. Barton of Boston. Barton, a dedicated congregational minister and former president of an American college in Turkey, changed Morgenthau's thinking about the missionaries' function in the region.
Christian missionaries in Turkey were carrying forward a magnificent work of social service, education, philanthropy, sanitation, medical healing, and moral uplift. They were, I discovered in reality, advanced agents of civilization.
When Morgenthau arrived in Constantinople in 1913, the Ottoman Empire was in turmoil. You know, first, I think it's worth noting that this was a colonial enterprise, an empire made up of the conquest of dozens and dozens of cultures and peoples that had been conquered and appropriated from the middle of the 15th century on.
It was an Islamic state stretching from the Balkans all the way to the Saudi Peninsula. The government, based in Constantinople, ruled over Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, Assyrians, and others. Heavily in debt, the empire was known as the sick man of Europe.
From the late 1880s on, Armenians began to protest for constitutional change. Not just for themselves, but for minorities. They were asking the question, can a Christian be the equal of a Muslim under Ottoman constitutional law? Christians had a decidedly second-class citizenship and were legally designated infidels. They had no protection in Islamic courts of law, which meant, of course, they could be fleeced of all their property at any time. Their women could be raped and abducted at any time. There was no recourse or redress to acts of wanton violence, tax extortion, and land dispossession.
In 1912 and 13, Constantinople lost almost 60,000 square miles of territory to Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria in the Balkan Wars. Facing economic ruin, the empire was coming apart at the seams.
By the time Morgenthau arrives in 1913, things have gone sour. The Balkan Wars have resulted in the loss of 85 to 90% of the Ottoman Empire's holdings in Europe. And so we're dealing with a very complicated moment as Ambassador Morgenthau arrives. And as soon as he arrives, he is a witness to a coup d'etat.
The bloody takeover was led by ultra-nationalist Ottoman officers, Mehmed Talat, Ismail Enver, and Ahmed Jamal. Their political party, the Committee for Union and Progress, promised a restoration of Turkish power.
There were many members who really saw the Armenians as a threat to the homogeneity of Ottoman Anatolia. They saw Anatolia as a kind of garden, and the Armenians as a kind of weed that needed to be removed in order for the Ottoman state to move forward, to be successful as a rejuvenated modern nation state. And that process leads to genocide.
And then Europe went up in flames. In June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. In a matter of months, the great powers of Europe, England, France, and Russia, were now in a bloody struggle against Germany and her allies, including the crumbling Ottoman Empire.
Germany supported the Ottoman Empire financially, but also militarily. They trained the Ottoman army for the war.
Morgenthau suddenly found himself in one of the most strategic positions in Europe, and he watched the Germans and the Turks with a wary eye. At the end of 1914, Turkish troops were handed a bloody and humiliating defeat against the Russians in the Battle of Seri Kamish. The Ottoman commander Ismail Enver had brought his troops to fight a winter battle on Russian-held territory. They were ill-prepared, and Turkey lost 80,000 men. A small percentage of the Russian forces, no more than 5,000, were ethnically Armenian. Enver, in a face-saving effort, sought to blame all Armenians for the loss of his men.
Here you have a very large, distinct ethnic Christian minority in eastern Anatolia. And there's a great deal of concern that these people are subversives. There's very little evidence. In fact, there's no evidence at all that the Armenians were trying to undermine the Ottomans. They were not being disloyal there. But this gets whipped up.
In the organization of the Armenian Genocide, one sees the precision of bureaucratic government planning from the start.
On April 24th, 1915, in Constantinople, on what would become known as Red Sunday, the Turkish regime would be Turkified.
The processes of Turkification that were put into motion would advocate a revival of Turkish strength, a revival of Turkish vitality, the idea of Turkey as a place only for Turks, by getting rid of Christian minority populations who were perceived as part of this problem of Turkey's decline and fall.
Approximately 250 Armenian leaders and intellectuals were rounded up and deported to a prison camp in the Anatolian East.
Their arrest, deportation, and eventual killing would be followed by more of the same in Van, Harpert, Diyarbakir, Erzurum, and so on, were similarly rounded up. And in this way, the Turkish government succeeded in wiping out almost an entire generation of Armenian intellectuals.
At the heart of that effort was a destruction of the communal relations and institutions that kept the Armenians together as a people. A destruction of their churches, a destruction of their schools, a destruction of their language and culture, the murder of their intellectuals and parliamentarians and journalists. The people who hold the community together and defined it as such were murdered at the outset of the genocide.
The idea is you cut the head off of the culture, you pull its tongue out, you silence its voice.
Though Armenian citizens had served the Ottoman Empire for centuries, they were now disarmed and put into labor battalions. This was the beginning of the Armenian Genocide.
The plan begins with the elimination of the able-bodied men who had been conscripted into the Ottoman army are disarmed and thrown into labor battalions so they could be gunned down by their Muslim fellow soldiers who did have rifles. By the time you get to the late spring of 1915, the Ottoman government has succeeded in eliminating most of the muscle of the Armenian population.
Just a month later, the Ottoman Parliament passed the Tesir Law that authorized the deportation of the Armenian people out of Anatolia. Armenians were ordered to leave their homes and possessions. Deportation was, in reality, a death sentence.
Every time it happened in each village, it was pretty much a carbon copy of the village before. First, an order would go out that the Armenian men between the ages of 15 and 60 were to report for military service. But None of these men were seen again.
In the Syrian desert of Deir Zor, it is estimated that as many as 300,000 people were killed or starved to death as part of the deportations.
We have terrible stories about how people would just starve to death by the side of the road and die. And those lucky enough to make it to one of the relocation camps, and I really think they should be called concentration camps on the outskirts of Aleppo, were executed en masse.
In a precursor to World War II, masses of civilians were packed into German rail cars and sent to certain death. In Trabzon, Armenians were loaded into boats and drowned in the Black Sea. The jails were emptied and criminals were organized into death squads. They killed at the direction of the government, and citizens joined in.
One of the terrors of the deportation was that almost all women were raped in some form, and that many of the children were stolen or taken by people en route from their families. To a Turkish family, this Armenian child represented a whole other kind of wealth. The child could be exploited at will, and often was, as a domestic servant, a slave. Ultimately, they were vulnerable to sexual exploitation, rape, and other things.
Not all Turks complied with the orders, and there were many instances where individuals were saved by Muslims who found the direction of the Turkish government an abomination. Governors who objected to Constantinople's orders were replaced with more willing leaders. The Assyrians, another Christian community, was also under Constantinople's boot. 275,000 of them were murdered or starved to death.
While the deportations are happening, there is some eyewitness happening as well, especially from the U.S. consuls like Leslie A. Davis.
Leslie A. Davis was the U.S. consul in Harput and answered to Morgenthau. His eyewitness accounts and dispatches to the State Department made clear that a genocide was in progress.
All of them were in rags, and many emaciated, sick, diseased, filthy, covered with dirt and vermin. One, whose face has haunted my memory ever since, was so emaciated, and the skin was drawn so tightly over her features, that her head appeared to be only a lifeless skull.
The news, the reporting on the Armenian Genocide is not only coming through the embassy. What you have are the missionaries themselves writing back to their boards. And they've got plenty of people back in the U.S. they're reporting to. And these are people who have influence with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson himself, he's the son of a Presbyterian minister.
The evidence was mounting. Independent reports came from not only the Americans, but from the missionaries, consuls, and diplomats of different nationalities. Even some Germans reported on the massacres.
And what's interesting is that the reports are all corroborating each other. The process of arrest, massacre, deportation, mass killing, rape, abduction, atrocity is all adding up. And so Morgenthau now is becoming the conduit to the West.
The ambassador put it bluntly in a cable to the State Department.
Deportation of and excesses against peaceful Armenians is increasing. And from harrowing reports from eyewitnesses, it appears that a campaign of race extermination is in progress under a pretext of reprisal against rebellion.
President Wilson is very well aware of what's happening to the Armenians from very early. But the problem is, what can we do about it? We are not in the war, and never are in the war against the Ottoman Empire.
As the U.S. was not at war with Turkey, Morgenthau could only raise his objections with the Turkish leader, Talat Pasha.
Why are you so interested in the Armenians anyway? You are a Jew. These people are Christians. Why can't you let us do with these Christians as we please?
My country contains something more than 97 million Christians and something less than 3 million Jews. So at least, in my ambassadorial capacity, I am 97% Christian. I do not appeal to you in the name of any race or any religion, but merely as a human being.
Determined to help the Armenians and the other persecuted Christian minorities, and with the blessing of Woodrow Wilson, Morgenthau gathered a group of his friends from back home who would do the work that the U.S. government could not.
When you're looking at American policy toward the Near East, and when especially you're looking at the man who's making American policy everywhere, Woodrow Wilson, there is a person who is central to this, and that is Cleveland Dodge. Cleveland Dodge was a very wealthy New Yorker. He becomes involved in both the founding of Robert College and in the support for the Syrian Protestant College, the university in Beirut. He also was a college classmate of Woodrow Wilson's at Princeton.
Dodge convened a meeting on September 16, 1915, at his Manhattan business headquarters.
A group of businessmen and leaders will come together in New York with a sense of urgency to form a committee of what would come to be known as Near East Relief by 1918.
Included in the men who Dodge brought together was James L. Barton, the missionary who Morgenthau had been so impressed by during his passage to Constantinople 2 years earlier, and Morgenthau's friend and advisor, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, who in the previous year had co-founded the NAACP. Dodge stepped forward and paid for all of the administrative expenses. In this way, every donation would go directly to helping the refugees.
This gave a very special and distinctive character to Near East Relief as a non-governmental organization, as an organization that saw itself as an expression of American identity, giving an opportunity for Americans to express themselves through giving, through sharing, that didn't rely on government assistance.
Barton was dispatched to Washington, where he was given full access to State Department cables. What he discovered was shocking. Millions of refugees were scattered throughout the region. They were in desperate need of food, shelter, and medical care. U.S. Consul Jesse B. Jackson reports 1 million dead by August of 1915.
James Barton could take his information that he was getting straight from the State Department, much of which was coming to them from missionaries who were on the ground, and have them in the papers the next day.
Reports began to appear in the press on a regular basis. The New York Times featured 145 articles about the genocide in 1915 alone. The American public became acutely aware of what was transpiring overseas. Local committees formed around the country to raise funds.
The Near East Relief is an expression of the depth of the connection of the Americans to the Armenian community. You see in so much of Near East Relief literature and their outreach and propaganda that they see the Armenians as a responsibility of Americans and of America.
Starving Armenians was a phrase that many became familiar with.
Now, part of Near East Relief's success had to do with its sophisticated ability to use modern media and advertising techniques in order to promote this humanitarian cause in many clever ways.
Graphic posters were created. They were elegant, simple in their messaging, and they struck a chord with the public.
These posters evolved a very unique vocabulary for Armenian relief, often emphasizing the nature of the victim, woman, the child, but also in several of the posters, the unique role America has to play in supporting and helping the peoples of the Near East. This was a way to express their solidarity with the war effort without having to fight.
In 1917, Near East Relief expanded their outreach in a most unexpected and groundbreaking way. They turned to Hollywood.
It's a kind of landmark moment in American cultural history because it brings together for the first time a major human rights relief project with the emergence of modern cinema.
A film would be made to stimulate a new round of donations. Ravished Armenia, also known as Auction of Souls, tells the true story of a young Armenian girl, Aurora Mardaganian. During her deportation, she is repeatedly raped and forced to convert to Islam. She witnesses a group of young women crucified and left to rot. Finally, she is sold as a slave to a Turkish harem. The lead actress in the film was none other than Aurora herself. During filming, she was surrounded by Turkish men and was unaware that they were hired actors. Within a year, she would suffer a nervous breakdown.
It's a kind of a bittersweet story. It's ugly in many ways, and Marta Gagnon was bitter for the rest of her life about the film project because she felt so used and abused.
The film, however, was a critical and box office sensation, raising sorely needed funds and creating a new awareness of the atrocities committed against the Armenian people. A steady drumbeat of news from abroad slowly turned the U.S. towards conflict. German atrocities in Belgium in 1914, the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, Germany's attempt to form an alliance with Mexico in 1917, and U-boat attacks against American ships finally brought U.S. entry into the war.
Woodrow Wilson very, very reluctantly took the United States into the war. He's very clear about not making common cause with the Allies. We don't even call ourselves one of the Allies. We call ourselves an associated power.
When the U.S. finally declares war, the missionaries feel that their vast holdings of real estate will be in jeopardy. This comes, of course, in contrast to their passionate concern for saving the Christians, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians. And they're caught in their own web of self-interest versus humanitarian impulse.
The only thing that could have helped the Armenians, really, would have been some kind of major military allied intervention. And the answer usually is no, absolutely not, we can't.
The United States never declared war against the Ottomans, but its intervention would be the decisive factor turning back German aggression. On November 11th, 1918, Germany surrendered. World War I was over. The victorious Allies now sought control over the Ottoman Empire.
After the war, the refugee problem was staggering. Now, not just among Armenians, but among Arabs, Kurds, Greeks, Assyrians, and other ethnic groups. And Near East Relief now emerged as a more expansive operation.
Up to that point, NER had relied largely on the missionaries' presence to carry out relief operations, but much more help would be needed.
The Near East relief workers who came over in 1919 expected that this was going to be the start of a great new age for the Near East.
This was seen as a grand project, and it was seen as a project that would also be a manifestation of American values in the Middle East. This idea of care and addressing suffering, but also building communities again.
In the next decade, over 1,000 Americans would volunteer to serve in the region.
They were doctors, they were nurses, they were journalists, they were bacteriologists, they were agricultural experts, they were secretaries and stenographers.
When you look at the letters home, there was such excitement at the time that this was really going to work. This would be a new Near East in which you would have education for women. This would be a new Near East in which there would be rough equality between the sexes. There would be political empowerment for minorities. This was going to be different. They just didn't have a sense of how brutal southern Anatolia was going to become while they were there.
The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, but the fighting was not over. Now, Mustafa Kemal, a distinguished military commander, pushed to consolidate power and create an independent Turkish nation.
Mustafa Kemal organized a series of campaigns of resistance against what he called or considered foreign invaders of the Anatolian Turkish heartland. In the west, against the Greeks, and in the east, against the Armenians. And of course, in the south, the French-occupied zone was where many of the efforts of Near East relief were taking place. In cities like Aintab and Marash, in cities that had been so central to this project of return, were now being threatened by invasion and civil war.
An early battle in the Turkish War for Independence took place in the city of Marash. Armenian refugees had returned, first under the protection of the British, and then under the French occupying forces. When the Kemalist troops invaded, the French retreated, abandoning the defenseless Armenians. Dr. Mabel Elliott, a Near East relief physician, was stationed there.
They had relied on us, on the promise of the great, powerful Allies. They had come back to Marash, to their wrecked homes and lives under our protection. Now they were being left to the Turks.
12,000 Armenians were massacred. Dr. Mabel Elliott fled along with 4,000 refugees into a brutally cold landscape. Only half of them survived. The purge of Christians had begun anew, and Near East Relief would need a trusted leader to move its operations and those under its care out of the war zone. Jakob Kunzler was a Swiss citizen and had been a carpenter, an evangelical deacon, and finally a medical surgeon. He worked alongside his wife Elizabeth in the German missionary hospital in Urfa. Now, Kunzler and the rest of Urfa's Near East Relief staff would have to move its orphans out of Turkey, all 8,000 of them. The journey was perilous. They traveled by truck, rail, mule, camel, and on foot through a punishing landscape. Along the way, they were harassed by Turkish officials and robbed by Kurdish bandits. After many harrowing days, frightened and exhausted, the children were safely delivered to new facilities in Aleppo and Beirut. But soon, another conflagration would create even more refugees and orphans. At the end of World War I, the Allies had allowed the government of Greece to send warships to the Turkish city of Smyrna, which had a large number of ethnic Greek Christians. Turkish nationalists rebelled and laid siege to the city. Under the eyes of the Allies, who were docked offshore, the Turks began to massacre the Christian community. The city was set aflame, and the Great Fire of Smyrna burned for 4 days. When it was over, tens of thousands were dead, and thousands more were left homeless and starving at the water's edge. Near East Relief, along with other private relief agencies, chartered ships and successfully evacuated 250,000 Greeks, Armenians, and Jews out of the ruins of Smyrna into Greece. Anatolia was now largely empty of its indigenous Christian population. The new nation of Turkey was now all that remained of the Ottoman Empire. Its minorities had either been killed, expelled, or abducted.
Most Armenian men between the ages of 15 and 50 were gone. And the survivor community was overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly old, and overwhelmingly children.
With the Turkish government no longer willing to guarantee the safety of its non-Muslim citizens, and with millions of desperate new refugees flooding the region, Near East Relief now had to coordinate dozens of orphanages, hospitals, and feeding centers in Syria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, Palestine, Greece, and Russia. The logistics were staggering.
This is the time when American sort of business acumen really gets to work. The Americans take 3 military posts at Alexandropol and convert them into orphan cities. They saw a massive problem, and they realized that it was going to have to be solved in this very impersonal, institutional way.
Near East Relief veteran Dr. Mabel Elliott was brought in to serve as medical director for these and other facilities. The challenges were enormous.
We found the medical relief of 40,000 children on our hands. I mean this literally. There was not one healthy child among them.
Trachoma was rampant, this very contagious eye condition, or scabies or favus or smallpox or TB or meningitis. And the form of treatment for trachoma wasn't comfortable. They had to take the eyelids of these little children and they would invert them and they would rub them with a copper sulfate pencil, sometimes until they would bleed. And they had to do that every day.
Life was tough in the orphanage. And often many of these young people were what we call half orphans, where their mother primarily couldn't afford to take care of the child and so placed them in the orphanage.
NER worker Mary Caroline Holmes wrote,
"One day I asked a group of children why I'd never heard anyone cry. 'We have shed all our tears. There are none left,' was the reply."
the children had been traumatized during the deportations, and many had lived an almost feral-like existence on the streets. Recovery would take time and care. Karnik Parnian, survivor.
We were afraid we would suddenly wake up and realize it had all been a dream. But every day we got bread and fresh vegetables and sometimes meat. The terror of hunger was becoming only a memory.
Once they got through the initial problems of survival, the food, the nutrition, and the health, they began to think about how could they help these children to get back in gear in terms of their education, and how could they help to prepare them for a future in which they could support themselves by having some kind of a trade or skill.
Near East Relief was introducing young people to real careers that they could use to build real lives and become leaders in their communities. And I think that's the critical dimension of Near East Relief policy, is that it understood that this sort of very American attitude towards education, towards training, would result in the building of community. One of the criticisms of them is that they were more interested in Armenians participating not in higher education or in advanced education, but in technical training. You know, you needed carpenters, you didn't necessarily need poets. You needed electricians, you didn't necessarily need novelists.
It was understood that funds would be hard to come by as the years progressed and memories faded. Now running an orphanage in Beirut, Jakob Kunzler knew that many young women suddenly cast out into the world in a traditional patriarchal society would be subject to easy exploitation. They would need to be able to fend for themselves. Aware that the region had a deep tradition in carpet weaving, Kunzler reached out to Hovannes Tastian, a master rug maker from Urfa. Together with only $400 from Near East Relief, they set up a two-loom factory in Gazier. Under their tutelage, young women learned patterns, dyeing techniques, and weaving. The operation was a rousing success, eventually growing to 100 looms and training over 1,400 young women. In order to meet the ongoing needs of the refugees and orphans, Near East Relief would have to stimulate a new round of fundraising. They came up with an ingenious promotion, Golden Rule Sunday. In 1923, on the first Sunday in December, American families were asked to have a paltry 4-cent meal, similar to what the orphans were served. The money saved would be donated to the organization. More than 1 million Americans participated. The campaign was a massive success, but now, with over 1 million refugees under their care and funding stretched to the limits, Near East Relief needed some high-profile help. Once again, they turned to Hollywood.
And if we think about the 1920s, it is the beginning of modern celebrity, the decade of Babe Ruth and Lindbergh and Jackie Coogan.
When Charlie Chaplin cast 5-year-old Jackie Coogan as the Kid, he could not have predicted the popularity of his choice. The picture was a box office smash, and it introduced Coogan to the masses. In 1924, at the age of 10, Coogan was enlisted to help publicize the ongoing work of Near East Relief. Jackie embarked on a cross-country train tour of the U.S. Millions of people turned out to greet the young Hollywood star, and he gathered over $1 million worth of food and supplies, which he personally delivered to orphanages in Athens, Greece. The media coverage elevated the international profile of the relief efforts as Coogan's exploits made headlines around the globe. Making news was very much on Jakob Kunzler's mind when he and Barclay Acheson, the director of NER Overseas Operations, devised their next fundraising promotion. The girls in Gazir would make a rug as a gift of appreciation for Calvin Coolidge, the new president of the United States. In 1925, it was presented to the White House to publicize Golden Rule Sunday. The media coverage spurred a record $4 million in donations in one day alone.
And there are pictures of 1,500 people gathered for a Golden Rule dinner in the New York Armory. Hotels donated their banquet rooms for Golden Rule Sunday dinners. Housewives would have Golden Rule teas. By 1927, organizations representing over 75 million Americans were supporting the Golden Rule Sunday concept. And this is a time when the population of America was only about 117 million. So this was a very important mainstream American movement.
Part of the Near East Relief appeal was saving children, and what can be more heart-tugging to the consciousness and conscience of ordinary people than saving innocent children.
South of Beirut was the Bird's Nest, perhaps the most idyllic of all the orphanages. In this rented seaside palace, the orphans were given the chance of a normal childhood with songs, schooling, and an abundance of much-needed love. NER worker Nellie Miller-Mann wrote,
To see 75 little tots squatted around the room singing and playing kindergarten games is a soul-thrilling sight. And they are not bashful, but animated, responsive, and full of initiative.
The future of the community depended on the success of the orphanages. Raising well-rounded young people included some novel solutions. Boy Scout troops were set up at many of the facilities. For young women, there were nurses' training programs. For both boys and girls, there was sports and music. A foundation for future growth was being laid.
The teachers' passion for their work and their love for us were obvious. They had basically become our parents, and we treated them as such.
So the community persevered because of these efforts, and I think that there's a genuine understanding amongst contemporary Armenians about not a sense of debt, but what role the Americans played in helping build them as a community.
I do not see how we can ever be grateful enough. You leave your homes and come out here and take care of us. And the people in America give their money to feed and clothe these little children. I do not know what would have happened to us had it not been for Near East Relief.
Although the U.S. government had provided military assistance in the transport of goods on behalf of Near East Relief, political infighting began to color Washington's stance over the plight and future of the Armenians.
Armenians invested a lot of hope in the Western powers, especially in the United States. Their dream was to have a homeland, but this dream never came to fruition because America withdrew from the region.
The Russian Revolution had ushered in a communist government, and the Soviets had subsumed the nascent state of Armenia. The French and British had carved up the remains of the Ottoman Empire. Morgenthau, no longer the ambassador, and now living back in the US, had been pushed out of the political scene. His stalwart defense of the Armenians had become an irritant to Washington's evolving position. Humanitarian concerns advocated by NER Chairman James L. Barton would no longer be the primary driver of US policy in the region.
They're just beginning to discover the oil there. They're just beginning to find the things that will really tie the United States and tie the West into what we now call the Middle East.
In Constantinople, Rear Admiral Mark Bristol, a distinguished naval commander, sat as U.S. High Commissioner. For Bristol, it was time for the U.S. to assume its role as a world power. It was time to do what America did best: business. And business needed a steady supply of oil.
Bristol represents, in many ways, the opposite idea to what Near East Relief, I think, at a certain moment really represented, which was that we are here to help the Armenians achieve justice, to help them rebuild their community, and to bring to them the kind of American modernity that we think will make this Near East that we care about a better place.
In what many would see as a betrayal of the Armenian people's aspiration for a homeland in Anatolia, Bristol forged closer ties with Mustafa Kemal, now known as Ataturk, as the Turkish leader molded his country into a westernized nation.
And in many ways, Bristol's vision was very reasonable. The Armenians had been exterminated as a people in Anatolia, that the Kemalists represented modernity. They were going to buy stuff from the United States, that they would be a bulwark against Soviet expansion into the Middle East and the Caucasus. I mean, that idea is not a Cold War idea, but dates from the time that Bristol is there.
By late 1929, the U.S. was plunged into the Great Depression. Unemployment soared, and bread lines formed across the country. Overseas, the orphans were now grown, and a once generous American public now focused on feeding itself, bringing an extraordinary chapter of citizen philanthropy to a close.
Well, Near East Relief reminds us that large pieces of our society can come together. Protestant missionaries, modern businessmen and entrepreneurs, and of course, grassroots movements among ordinary Americans nationwide that emphasized the value in giving to others, the value in working for others, the value of service.
23 Near East relief workers died in service, mostly from disease. One, Reverend James Wright, was shot and killed by bandits.
They answered a call, and many of them died in answering that call. And so I think it's a very important example of early American international humanitarianism.
In some ways, it embodied a very positive ethos in the American experience. An ethos of giving, of sacrifice, of reaching out, of concern for those outside of your own borders. It has a lot to do with propelling a more global orientation in American history.
In the course of 15 years, Near East Relief raised over $116 million, the equivalent of over $2 billion in today's dollars. They provided medical care to 6 million and fed more than 12 million people. Families were reunited wherever and whenever possible. And in the end, 132,000 orphans were raised to adulthood. George Mardikian, NER Boy Scout leader and survivor.
Americans, the most humane people in the world, had saved my life and sheltered me when my own people could not lift a hand.
We are here on the shoulders of these orphans. Maybe one thing that unites us all is this story, how they were saved.
NER Chairman James L. Barton said it best.
This is a narrative of American philanthropy. In all the stories of the Great War, we doubt if there is one more tragic, more colorful, more heroic.
I think at this time of our history, to remind people of what America did stands out as an unusual part of our history that should not be forgotten, but should be remembered again and again.